It's interesting. You got a book blurb from Jeff Pearlman.
Yes.
It's kind of related to your book, but I interviewed him for his Bo Jackson book, the one that just recently came
Oh, cool.
out. And
Yeah.
I said to him, like, your name comes up a lot. Like, he seems to help a lot of writers or, like, give them book blurbs or he's kind of involved in that sports writing community. And he was like, yeah, when I was much younger, I used to be an asshole. That was his direct word. And he was like, I didn't care about anybody else. I was the best. Like, it was kind of like a very Gary Payton kind of, like, attack mode, right? He was like, and so as he got older, he realized that his success or somebody else's success doesn't detract from his success.
Right. Yeah, no, and it's someone like him is going to get asked a lot, and he's so prolific in his work that he just might not have time for it. So yeah, I definitely wasn't, necessarily expecting it, but I was grateful to him for it.
Yo, welcome to My Summer Lair. I'm your host, Sammy. I talk trash even more than Oscar the Grouch Younan. Let's hop on the DeLorean and go back in time to Game 1 of the 1997 NBA Finals. The score is tied at 82 with 9.2 seconds left in the game. It's the Chicago Bulls with Jordan and Pippen versus the Utah Jazz with Karl Malone and John Stockton. Game 5 of the 1997 NBA Finals is Jordan's famous flu game. But before all that, we got to finish Game 1. Karl Malone was fouled by Dennis Rodman with 9.2 seconds left, and with the score tied, he had a chance to give the Jazz the lead. At the time, as he stepped up to the free throw line, Karl Malone was a 74.2% shooter. 74% is pretty decent. He should make at least one of these literally called free throws. Before shooting his two key free throws, Scottie Pippen said to Karl Malone, "The mailman doesn't deliver on Sundays." Turns out Pippen was right. The mailman did not deliver on Sundays. Karl would go on to miss two free throws in a row. The Bulls rebounded, and Michael Jordan scored the game winner. They won Game 1. The Jazz, of course, would go on to lose the entire finals. What Pippen said to Malone, "The mailman doesn't deliver on Sundays," is highly effective trash talking. Oh my gosh, I heart trash talking so much. That's why I was elated. Rafi Kohan has written Trash Talk, the only book about destroying your rivals that isn't total garbage. This book is fantastic. I so enjoyed reading it, and I honestly I can't bring myself to trash talk it. It's really good. Rafi's book explores trash talking through a number of notable lenses, from art to science to psychology. I opened this My Summer Lair conversation drawing trash-talking parallels with graffiti because it's the same cultural impulse. It's all the same culture. Basketball and hip-hop and graffiti and trash-talking are all the same culture. Just like going to France and you get wine and cheese and baguettes, art and more. It's all the same culture. With basketball and hip-hop and graffiti and trash-talking, yes, it's all the same culture, but more importantly, it's our culture. This My Summer Lair episode, is gloriously dedicated to everyone who grew up watching NBA in the 90s. If you don't know what I'm talking about, yo, there's the door. Tell your fat mom I said hi when you get home. Don't be basic. You'll dig this episode, so share it. Find a friend, find a foe, and share it. There's no reason why this podcast, with this episode on trash talking, can't take out Joe Rogan for at least one episode. Joe has the biggest podcast in the world, but only for today. Tomorrow always comes with fresh stories and different stories. We didn't all come this far just to back down now, right? Especially to a podcast host who couldn't get his facts right if he was left to his own devices. Yo, let's go.
Sound, the final frontier. My Summer Lair is an enterprise, a pop culture voyage with a continuing mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new creators and celebrate established producers, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now here is your host, Sammy Younan.
I typically start off interviews, and you might have a similar technique too, where like I ask a couple of like softball questions to kind of ease into the topic. But for this one though, I want to get to the heart of the matter because I adore trash talking. like, that's my jam. You talk about like the actual term was coined in early 80s and then really took off in the 90s in your book, Trash Talk, the only book about destroying your rivals. So I think that's part of why it feels like I like it so much because it's got that 80s, 90s vibe to it. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, as I, make the case in the book, trash talk is really nothing new. It's something that's existed throughout time and across cultures. This idea of, competitive incivility, talking crap, whatever name it's gone by. But to your point, trash talk as a term didn't exist, until the 1980s, and then really blew up in popularity in the 1990s. 1993 was kind of the year of trash talk when, Sports Illustrated and the New York Times and all these major national publications were writing trend stories about it as this kind of exotic new phenomenon, this thing that was taking over the sports world. And so I think there is something, I mean, this wasn't my intention with writing the book, but I think there is something sort of inescapably 90s about our conception of trash talk because of the basketball players that were coming up at that time. And as hip hop was sort of trickling into the culture and taking over the culture, that there's this, there's just like this cocktail of kind of visuals and verbals and, that are kind of all wrapped up together. And you can think about it in terms of like these neon and pastel colors and starter jackets and, images of, Gary Payton sort of jawing at someone on the court. It all just like, I think for sports fans of the 90s, I think it just screams 1990s.
Yeah, it's funny you mention like the hip hop and even that it's been like has had different terms or different incarnations throughout the centuries. Like reading your book, it reminded me a lot of graffiti, right? Which of course we've been drawing on walls for like forever since the early man, right? And for me, like when I see graffiti, like I'm in New York or Detroit or LA or something, and I see graffiti, and I'm like, oh, and I go right to the wall and right to the mural, and I look at it, and I take photos, and I look at the colors and the style and whatever. I find it all very thrilling. Other people, they look at graffiti and then they're like, this is urban decay or like, this is a terrible neighborhood. Sometimes there's even a little hint of racism kind of under like their tone, like the way they're talking about graffiti. And trash talking kind of falls in that same thing as graffiti, right? Like it's very kind of like old school 90s, but also at the same time kind of like very polarizing in terms of like how people view it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think graffiti, sort of again, the kind of the aesthetics of graffiti very much fit into that kind of 1990s vibe of that in the same way that trash talk fits into them. And of course, graffiti comes up, is one of the pillars of hip hop, and hip hop and the sort of the influences like the dozens, right? This game of traded insults that's endemic to Black American communities informs what we now think of as modern American trash talk. And so I think graffiti is very much coming from that same, cultural impulse and this idea for both like cultural expression, artistic expression, personal expression, right? And it can mean so many different things to so many different people. And of course, it can be appropriated in different ways. I mean, a gang tagging a wall is very different than an artist who's, sees, the side of a train as his or her canvas. Mm-hmm. So I think the way we look at graffiti is very much as the way, is very personal in the same way that the way we hear trash talk is very personal, right? And sort of the values we ascribe to that probably say more about us than what they do about, the person who is talking the shit or, spraying the wall. And yeah, this idea that we will kind of that we will ascribe sort of morality and moral judgment to these things, speaks to kind of cultural conventions or cultural ideas and metrics like sportsmanship, right? This idea of being a good sport.
Mm-hmm.
But who gets to define what it means to be a good sport? And whose culture is represented in that? That's one of the things that when in the 1990s, after trash talk became, sort of as popularized as it was, there was a backlash, right? And this was idea that maybe this was unsporting behavior and needed to be policed in some ways, needed to be penalized. But the lens through which we were viewing it was this kind of white American lens of sportsmanship, which didn't account for the sort of the cultural input or the cultural the expressions that may come up from from someone who grew up playing in Oakland, California on the playgrounds, who grew up in a culture of trash talk and the dozens and hip hop. And so I think graffiti is very much the same thing in that way. Absolutely.
You used a great phrase because you're talking about the culture right now, and you used a great phrase in the book. You were writing about Gary Payton and his motor mouth, his infamous motor mouth, and you used the phrase that you used was cultural imperative. That was kind of like what was his spark or his fuel, I guess, was this cultural imperative. And again, this circles back to graffiti as you're talking about the four elements of hip hop. Like, that's why I was never afraid when I go into a neighborhood and I see graffiti or I saw like trash talking like with Reggie Miller and Gary Payton, those guys back in the 90s. Like, to me, it was all the same cultural expression. What did you mean by like a cultural imperative? Can you kind of unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah. So I think it's some of the things we were saying in terms of this idea of personal expression, artistic expression, competitive expression. It's the idea that you can be yourself on the court, right? The idea that you can compete as your true self. You don't need to somehow tame, who you are, the way you interact. And a big part of I think the policing and the penalization of trash talk, especially in the 1990s, was about control. It was about controlling behavior, controlling the expressions, the celebrations, most notably of Black athletes, because it was seen as somehow transgressive. It was seen as outside the norm because the league administrators, the officials, didn't grow up in that culture, right? And so I think there is in some ways, there's an imperative for everybody to be themselves, to be able to show up as their true self, to compete as their true self. Someone like, to use the example of Gary Payton, right, very clearly grew up in a trash talk environment. Mm-hmm. His dad was a trash talker. There was trash talk, on the playground. There was trash talk in high school. There was trash talk off the playground, right? I mean, games like the dozens. And so that is, again, that informs then not only kind of like who you are as a person, but also in terms of how you compete. The idea of playing basketball and not talking trash was almost, it was an impossibility for Gary Payton. Like, you were stripping away part of his game, part of who he is, and if he can't do that, then so there's a cultural, I think the phrase cultural imperative is in fact almost it's almost a moral imperative in some ways. It's a more moral imperative for all of us to kind of understand, create space for people to show up as their authentic selves, to compete as their authentic selves. Another example of this, just to give a quick tangent, you can look at, this is, for American and North American audiences, the idea of there being trash talk in cricket is probably, so contrary to what our expectations are.
A gentleman's game.
Gentleman's game. But there is, in fact, a ton of trash talk in cricket. It's called sledging. And nowhere was this more the case than in Australia, and especially in Australia from the 1970s and into the 1990s. And there was a culture of sledging in Australia that existed both within, club and amateur settings for cricket, but beyond, people just gave each other shit, right? It's a way to express intimacy in the same way we think about the dozens, and same way we think about razzing our friends when we're just hanging out. And when they showed up to international competitions, and this is even more so, I would say, in the 1970s, when they really sort of broke onto the stage and they arrived as this sensibility clash with everyone else. it wasn't just that they were talking shit because they were looking for a competitive advantage. They did want to play an aggressive style of cricket, but it was an expression of their Australianness, right? Mm-hmm. Like asserting themselves on the global stage. And so for someone like Gary Payton or Serena Williams, especially you can think about her, and some of the tournaments where she's been confronted with, like at Indian Wells, where notoriously she refused to play because of the racism she confronted there. But to celebrate in a way that is true to yourself and true to your culture, is a way to proclaim, here I am and I belong, to celebrate yourselves in those moments. And so I do think that there is an imperative to it, because I think what it speaks to is, sort of like a deeply healthy thing.
Yeah, this authentic self and expressing yourself and who you are. Like, is this book, your Trash Talk, is this a self-help book, or is this like kind of like a sarcastic how to win friends and influence people by trash talking them manual in a sense?
It's definitely not a manual in a traditional sense. You're not going to read this and get like a how-to guide of how to sort of get into someone's head on the court. That being said, I mean, it's not a self-help book either, but I think my goal for the book was more than anything just to take trash talk seriously, as a topic with real gravity, as something that has been dismissed, especially in the United States culturally, as frivolous, right? As something that's unserious, as something that is just noise. But I think by doing that, we're ignoring not only the ways that, trash talk can explain not only our sort of modern culture and our modern selves to us within America within the last 30 to 50 years, but also we can understand something about ourselves as social and competitive creatures if we actually explore it as this kind of mode of communication, this language of competition that has existed throughout time. All that being said, I do think that if you read this book the right way, you can become a better trash talker.
Yeah.
and it's not because I'm going to give you some like incredible insult that nobody can come back from. I mean, that would be impossible, because the best trash talk for any individual person is going to be individualized no matter what.
You tailor it.
Yeah, you have to. But also because if you want to be an effective and strategic trash talker, you have to understand how this stuff works. And to understand how it works, you have to take it seriously, which was my whole goal, right? To unpack not just the history of it, the culture of it, the evolution of it, but also to look at the underlying science and the psychology of it, to understand what are the mechanisms at play, to understand what makes someone more sensitive, or not. So I do think, again, that like this is not like a snaps book of, joke book, but at the same time, if you want to read this and become a better trash talker, you will become a better trash talker.
What you're talking about too is like stand-up comedy. I think a lot of people just assume that like Kevin Hart or Dave Chappelle or one of these guys is just naturally funny. They just get up and they tell some stories, and there is an element of that as well. But as Seinfeld has proven repeatedly, there's a science to writing a joke, right? And the word choices that you make, and like you can figure out how to construct a joke properly, and that'll make you a better comic. And it's the same thing. It's not always like with like trash talking. It's not always just making fun of the kid just because he's fat or he was wearing glasses, like the obvious things. Those sometimes don't pierce the skin because they're so obvious. But if you can figure out a better way to kind of package your sarcasm, your snaps, right, then they have a better chance of like hitting the prime target.
Yeah, I mean, I get into this a little bit when we talk about the I talk about roast battle in the book, right, which is sort of like rap battle. For people who don't know, it's rap battle, but with two comics who are insulting each other back and forth.
Jeff Ross is really famous for that. If people see him,
yeah,
the bald guy.
Yeah, he's the roast master who I had a chance to spend some time with. But I also spent time with a roast joke writer named Mike Lawrence, and he talks about emotional roasting. Right, it's this idea that you, like, as you were saying, you don't say the obvious thing. Sometimes the obvious thing may be the thing to say if someone has a real insecurity about it, and that's going to steal their attention in one form or another. But emotional roasting, as he explained it to me, is you kind of decide, like, well, what are the things that you really don't want me to say? What are the things you can't even admit to yourself? And you go at those kinds of insecurities, and so that's, but the point, I think, the sort of, the common denominator with that is you need to say something if you're trying. I mean, if this is the way that you're trying to talk trash, because there are lots of ways. There's polite trash talking. There's, there's insulting trash talk. There's, just purely distraction, trash talk via distraction. But if you're trying to say the insulting thing that gets at someone's insecurity, you need to go at them in a way that is going to be undeniable, right? In a way that it's going to be impossible for them to shut that out. But to go back to the point about craft, and there is craft to joke writing, and it's about what you say, but it's also about how you say it.
Mm-hmm.
And it can also be about when you say it, right? Like, if you say something that's easily dismissible, or you say it, let's say, pregame, when I have time to kind of recenter and regain my focus, maybe that's not going to work. But saying a thing that is going to stick in someone's mind and becomes undeniable is that's one of the ways to be an effective trash talker. So you can think about, Gary Payton once said to this NBA player named Jamie Fike, who was, end of bench type player. He said to him, "You're not going to even be in the league next year." That was his. And for Jamie Fike, that struck a real nerve, because he was insecure about his place on the roster. He was insecure about his place in the league, and it was harder for him to dismiss that because it was a genuine insecurity. So if you can find someone's genuine insecurity, you push them, not to get too sciencey on it, though I do get sciencey in the book, you push them into what's known as a threat state, right? And when someone's in a threat state, we have a biological response to that in our bodies that actually detracts from performance, right? We're preparing for attack when we're in a threat state. And so that's a terrific way to make someone play poorly.
Yeah. Where does pettiness fit into all of this? Because I also enjoy pettiness as well, and this is part of another, I guess, a subgenre of trash talking.
Well, yeah. I mean, pettiness is inherent to trash talk, right? That, like, there was a study that came out of Georgetown and the University of Pennsylvania that looked at trash talk in the workplace from a few years ago. And one of the things they found is that the targets of trash talk were more motivated to see their opponents lose as a result. It wasn't that they were more motivated to win. They were more motivated to see their opponents lose. And if you think about what that means, that's reaching a level of extreme pettiness, right? Yeah. It's saying, like, I don't care if this costs me something, as long as it costs you more,
right?
And that is, and that's true throughout, throughout human time, that we are petty with our rivals. Mm-hmm. We are petty with people that we see as our antagonists, and so, again, pettiness can be used in a number of ways, or I think manifests in a number of ways with trash talk. One is, you'll see it like guys like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and Tiger Woods, right? That they'll imagine these kinds of slights, right? They'll create motivations for themselves, but it's because they understand that it's going to trigger this kind of, like, pettiness mechanism in their mind that's going to create motivation that wouldn't otherwise exist. But because it does make us petty, you'll also just see some, like, truly petty behavior, which which we all love, because, pettiness is hilarious.
Yeah. Like, you see it all the time on Inside the NBA, where Shaq and Barkley are arguing about something, and one of them calls the other one, like, petty white, right? Like,
yeah,
because they're always talking about their records or what they achieved when they were playing back in the day. And so that's also funny too, because I like that aspect of the pettiness of what you're talking about with Jordan and, like, Tiger, for example. There's an element of keeping the receipts or the track record. And like you said, in sports, generally there's a clear winner and a clear loser. Sometimes the ref will blow a call or something like that. It might be controversial. But almost 80 or 90% of all the games, end with a clear winner. Like, this team was better than you today, and they beat you, or they beat you 4 times in that 7-game series. But in business or in life, there's no clear winners, right? Like, you know what I mean? Amazon might beat, like, Apple for 3 or 4 financial quarters, and that's great. And then Apple releases some new iPhone, and then they're back on top, and then Amazon's down. Like, there isn't the same kind of clarity. So, like, pettiness is great at keeping the receipts and keeping the track record, so that when you, like you said, I want to say you lose, when you can come back and say, I've proven that you've lost now. There's a joyfulness to pettiness.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it might not be like the healthiest human impulse that the joy that or expression, the healthiest expression, the joy that comes out of pettiness. But absolutely, I mean, why do we keep receipts? Because of pettiness, right? Why do we say the thing? Why do we have to rub salt in the wounds? After someone loses, because of pettiness. Why does when Damian Lillard misses those 2 free throws at the end of the game against the Clippers in the bubble, famously, toward the end of the regular season, and Paul George and Patrick Beverley are then, not only talking shit on the sidelines, but then up in the comment sections on Instagram talking shit to him. That's pettiness. But at the same time, Damian Lillard used that same pettiness as motivation to then score 50 points in the next 3 games after that. Right. So it's, pettiness, as with all of trash talk, is a double-edged sword. Yeah. It cuts both ways, right? We can use it, we can use it to gloat, we can use it for motivation, we can use it to try to demoralize someone, but we never really know how someone else is going to respond.
And this idea too of demoralizing someone, you have a fascinating theme that runs throughout your book, Trash Talk. It's the idea of the fringe status, right? That trash talking, it's almost like an eviction notice for the tribe. Like you said, like, you don't belong in the NBA. You don't belong here, right? And it's that idea that you can, like, you separate that person. And that's sometimes where a lot of insecurity comes through, because you don't always feel like you fit in. So if you can provoke that, like, you have no business being here. Larry Bird was great at that. You know what I mean? He's like, I'm going to go left. Are you going to guard me? I'm going left.
Yeah, and Larry Bird would say exactly that. I mean, I think it was the first time he played against Dominique Wilkins. He literally said to me, he's like, you don't belong here, Holmes. Like, you don't belong in this league. I mean, it's kind of, it almost becomes cliche trash talk at this point. Like, you can't guard me or whatever. But it's like, if you really stop to think about it, it's one of the most insulting things you can say to someone. It's one of the most threatening things you can say to someone, is that you don't belong here. You have no business being on this court, right? And what that taps into is, as you were saying, is this kind of like primal fear that has existed throughout human history about being rejected from the tribe, about being ostracized from the tribe. If we don't belong, it's fear of social rejection. And if we feel like we don't belong, like we don't measure up, we're going to get kicked out of the tribe. And that taps in to these incredibly primal fears of, like, well, how am I going to feed myself? How am I going to hunt for food? How am I going to protect myself from predators? So it's really interesting that, like, as evolved as we can be, however many thousands of years, after, crawling out of the primordial soup and into caves and, around fire pits and beyond, that these really deeply ingrained fears are the same things that we can, like, most easily tap into and create insecurity around.
Nobody wants to be picked last in gym.
Right. And it's not just that, like, you might not even care about being a great athlete, right? But there's something about that public humiliation, about being picked last, of being seen publicly as not measuring up, that's incredibly threatening. And again, this idea of threat is one of the things that, when we talk about sports psychology, is so important in terms of, like, whether or not trash talk might work, is, can you make someone feel threatened? And it's not about physical threat. It's about all these other types of psychological threat.
I think a great example of what you're talking about is Russell Westbrook. When he was playing for the LA Lakers, he was terrible. Like, there's no really way around that. Like, he was shooting like 28% or even lower sometimes from 3-point. He had terrible fourth quarters where he would go for 0 for something. And so eventually he got saddled with the name West Brick. But what was fascinating about the name West Brick was that this wasn't, like you said, just two guys, Larry Bird or somebody on the court. Like, this wasn't players from Sacramento or the Warriors trash talking him. Fans were trash talking him and calling him West Brick. So now this is like social media's added a new element where, like, guys like Jordan and Bird and Magic, when they played, they only had to deal with trash talking for the 2 hours or the 48 minutes of a game. But now guys like Russell Westbrook have to constantly hear chirping from fans on social media, and that's a consistent, like, rejection, like, you don't belong here.
Well, it brings up an interesting point, a couple of things. One is that you say, well, they have to deal with it, right? This 24/7, they have no choice. It exists on social media. It exists around the clock. But that's actually not true, right? He doesn't have to deal with it. He chooses to engage with it, right? Any of us can choose whether we want to opt into, the chatter of social media, whether we want to hear the discourse back and forth, or if we would just want to delete the app, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you don't have to look for that kind of validation or criticism or judgment. It exists. You're obviously 100% right that it exists in all of these places in this surround sound way that didn't happen before. But it's not inherent to us that, like, we have to be exposed to it. We do have some agency there. And the other interesting thing about Russell Westbrook, I almost called him Westbrook, which would have been bad. But
he's a lot better now.
Yes, and I'm so happy for him because he's like, I love Russell Westbrook. Like, as a player, his passion, there's something so noble about the way he plays the game, the way he cares. But, when he sort of, came out publicly and asked people to stop calling him Westbrook, right? He said, that's my name and it dishonors my name and I can't handle that. That speaks to one of the other really prominent ways, or, like, easiest ways to get into someone's head with trash talk is to go at their ego, right? Because we're all prideful people, and elite athletes even more so, have this outsized pride. But if you allow your ego to be, to be the framework through which you're engaging with people, if you respond out of pride, then you're not then you're allowing yourself to respond in a way that may be dysfunctional to peak performance, right? We can think about things like honor culture. Honor cultures exist around the world, and the way that I always think about it is sort of like, the old Southern, in the U.S. and the South, the Southern United States, somebody would feel dishonored and they would take off their white glove and slap someone across the face and say, I demand satisfaction, right? You're doing that because you feel like you've been insulted. Your pride has been hurt. But, like, you're allowing yourself to be insulted. You're allowing your pride to be hurt because you're making your pride matter. You're making your reputation matter in a way that it doesn't need to. Like, ego is the best way to go at somebody because it's going to make them respond in ways that they should not, right? And you can think about that on the court. If you say to someone, he can't go left. Well, what if you really can't go left, but your ego is so big that you just want to prove me wrong, and now you're driving left all game, even though that's not just, suboptimal for your own performance, but also contrary to the game plan. So I just think ego is just as much as we think about insecurity as being, a great avenue to go at people, going at someone's ego is just as good, if not better.
But the thing is with ego is that, like, guys like Jordan could back it up. So if you go at Jordan like, man, you can't guard me, you suck, you're bald, you're lazy, you call him whatever you want, Jordan will then go out and destroy you. Like, you know what I mean? So ego goes both ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that I would say that trash talk goes both ways, right? Mm-hmm. That, who you are talking and who you're talking to and how you talk to them, can have very different outcomes, right? Someone like Jordan, he was able to channel whatever you gave him into his performance, to focus on the performance itself. Right. And to perform it at the best of his abilities. Also, look, he's also just such an outlier in these conversations because maybe he was distracted. Maybe he was responding out of ego, but he was so good that it didn't matter. Right. Mm-hmm. That's possible. But someone like Russell Westbrook, who's a superstar level player, right? A superstar level player with some flaws in his game, because most people have flaws in his game. But when you start pointing those out, when you start pointing out that he's missing from the outside and occasionally missing badly in like ugly and hilarious ways that make great viral clips on YouTube. And he responds to that by feeling attacked, by feeling threatened and wanting to prove you wrong. Like, he's not using that in a functional way to improve his game. He's not using that in a functional way to sort of tap into the game plan. It's detracting from what he's doing on the court. It's distracting from what he's doing on the court. So some people use trash talk to motivate. Some people motivate themselves. Some people use trash talk to kind of get into their zone of optimal functioning, to raise their arousal and anxiety levels, because they need to be all revved up to be at their best. You can think of Kevin Garnett. Some people use trash talk to tap into the game, right? To remind themselves to focus on the game intently, to engage and to increase their effort. Reggie Miller, right, with Spike Lee. Like, even though, like, you could say, oh, he's talking to this guy on the sidelines, he's distracted. But the level of distraction pales in comparison to like the benefit he got from improving his performance, from engaging in, from refocusing refocusing on the play, the task at hand. So it's not, none of this stuff you can paint with an entirely broad brush and say, like, this is the way all of this works. Like we said before, that for the same reason that I can't just tell you the one insult that's going to work on everyone. Mm-hmm. You have to know how you respond to trash talk. You have to know how your opponent responds to it and use it accordingly.
So as we're wrapping up then, like, you didn't seem to come to a firm agreement in terms of like what's too far. Like you said, it's kind of tailored, right? And so have you now, as you put the book out into the world and people kind of react to it a little bit more, as you kind of like see how people view this kind of stuff, is there such a thing as like too far? Or is it just like you said, every individual is different, and so you just kind of, you figure it out as you go?
Right. The question of the line. How far is too far? Yeah. Where do we draw the line? I mean, my point in the book is not so much that I don't think there is a line. I do think there is a line. It's more that there's an inherent problem with the line, which is twofold. One is that people will never agree on how far is too far, because your sensitivities might not map cleanly onto my own sensitivities, or the things that I find morally reprehensible might be different from what someone else does. But the second point there is that even if you and I agree that there might be a line, and we might not agree exactly where it is, there are some people who will say there is no line, because that's the whole point. I want to cross the line because that's how I offend you. That's how I make you feel threatened. That's how I steal your attention, is by saying something so reprehensible that it's impossible to dismiss. But that doesn't mean that there can't be lines, or that there shouldn't be lines. And I think, we could look at the example of Colby Covington from this past weekend, who was, fighting against Leon Edwards. And he said all these horrendous things about his father, who was murdered, mm-hmm. right? I mean, most of us will agree that that's like disgusting to to be talking shit about someone's murdered father and, disparaging him. Not only are you like exploiting this grief, but you're also doing it in a particularly disgusting way.
You get branded as an asshole too.
Well, so that's the question. It's a question of recourse, right? It's a question of what is the recourse. And, I think, obviously in the UFC, there's the immediate recourse of like getting to punch each other in the face. So you could say in some ways, maybe that's like the perfect venue for any, and Dana White makes this case. It's the perfect venue for exactly this kind of shit talk, or any kind of shit talk, because you have to back it up and you're putting your face and your chin on the line. But at the same time, there's other recourse too. One is there's shame, right? There's public shame, right? And all of these fighters have come out afterwards and before saying, I hope Leon, knocks Colby out. I hope he breaks his arm and like really, really destroys him during the fight. And after the fact, everyone is saying that Colby Covington is a piece of shit, right? But that only works if Colby Covington has shame in this regard. I'm not saying that he doesn't have any shame, but he seems particularly shameless in this case, right? He does not seem to be scolded by other people's opinions. So without that mechanism of recourse, it doesn't do us any good to say there is or isn't a line, because it doesn't stop him from saying it, right? And that's more my point. And then there's the question then comes in to say, like, well, how could you stop this person from saying it? And the only way to stop is if there are official mechanisms of recourse, right? Because the possibility of getting punched in the face didn't stop him. Mm-hmm. The possibility of public shame didn't stop him. So would the UFC ever adopt a kind of code of conduct or code of language that says these are the things that are off limits, these are the things you can't say? Dana White came out and said that he thought it was nasty. He thought what he said was nasty, and he thinks that bringing people's families into it is a line in his own mind that he finds morally disgusting. But he also says that he's never going to tell people what they can or can't say. And if he, as the proprietor and administrator of the UFC, is not going to do that, then it's meaningless, right? He could create a line. He could, and I wouldn't suggest that he just, unilaterally do it just based on his own opinions, right? That creates problems like, the idea of, the policing of trash talk in the 90s and sportsmanship, right? You need to, I think it's worth at least considering the ways in which you can accommodate different types of trash talk and find that middle ground of what's acceptable. But if he is not going to do that, if he's not going to consider that, then these things are going to happen. The line is going to be crossed, and it's going to happen again and again. And it's look, even if we did do that, you would still have people, right, getting upset with one another because maybe you have someone from one culture. Mm-hmm. This happens in cricket. The Australian players call players from India bastards, and in Australia, that's considered a term of endearment. Like they might not have been using it in an endearing way, but it's not considered like a horrible thing to say. In India, it's considered incredibly offensive. So you're going to have this kind of the cultural clashes, especially in international competition. So again, it's not that there isn't a line; it's that lines exist everywhere. And I do think it's important to have the conversation about what happens when we cross the line, right? What kind of ideas are we introducing into the public sphere? What are we normalizing? And I would suggest that someone like Dana White has a responsibility to at least consider that, right? And whether or not he would legislate against it in some way or another, I think it's a little, it's a little easy. It's a little hack to just say like, well, people are going to say whatever they want. Mm-hmm. Like, you are introducing discourse into the public sphere that you find morally reprehensible. Maybe take a minute to think about it.
This idea of introducing discourse into the public sphere, it echoes a lot of when Trump was first running for presidency. And I don't want to always bring everything back to Trump. I know that's a common example, but again, just because he's such a product of the 80s and 90s. So when he was like giving everybody like nicknames and like talking about his dick size and these kind of things or whatever, part of me was laughing because it's like, I know where he's coming from. I know this culture and like this makes sense, but it out in the political sphere, it doesn't make sense. This level of discourse that you're talking about, right? Like if this was like Muhammad Ali saying, "I'm the greatest" to Sonny Liston or something like that, that makes sense. And then they can go and they can bash each other in the ring. In the political sphere, it didn't make sense. He was violating norms or established norms or unspoken rules. And so that's where a lot of people started to get rubbed the wrong way.
Well, even that idea of does it make sense or not? It's like, well, did it make sense? He won, right? Yeah. So it's like, did it make sense? Maybe it, by that metric, maybe it did make sense. But does it make sense in terms of like the way we want to be as a society, like the way we want to treat one another? The types of things that we want to accept not just in terms of the way we treat other people, but the way other people treat us too. I mean, look, Trump brought trash talk tactics to the political sphere in a way that had never been done before.
Mm-hmm.
That isn't to say that incivility didn't exist in politics. There's always been incivility, especially in politics. In Roman politics, early America, there was actually like a civilizing movement in the early 1900s that tried to restrain the incivility and violence of politics. And it's those more recent norms that Trump is really transgressing, which isn't to take away from that transgression. I mean, there's still repercussions for that. His nicknames, his showmanship, carnival barking, his marketing, talking about his dick size. We could even say that some of that stuff is acceptable, like within the realm of like a debate stage, within the realm of like talking to your peers. But the thing about Trump is that he demonstrated no limits whatsoever on what he said or to whom he said it, right? It wasn't just that he was talking trash. He was also bullying.
Mm-hmm.
He was looking not for a response, which I would suggest is, a prerequisite of trash talk, is that you're presenting a challenge and looking to see how the person is going to respond. Whereas he was talking, he was verbally abusing in a way to shut people up, in a way to shut down discourse, to shut down, people who disagreed with him, who wouldn't pledge fealty to him. And, that's more fascist than anything else. I mean, that's not, I think there was a point at which he stopped talking trash and started to be abusive. But even still, I think that even in the trash talk, it's, we could have that conversation about like, what is the sort of societal impact of that? And do we want to accept it or not? And frankly, we should be having those conversations before we start having it about, athletes.
Yeah, and that's what I like too about trash talking is because you get a chance to respond. So when somebody says to you, you don't belong here in the NBA, we're like, all right, I'm going to put 20 on you now. All right. Like you get a chance to respond. And it's the same thing when you were talking about like with Jeff Ross and the roast battle in the comics or whatever. They both get to go back and forth with each other. It's not like one comic's just using the other one as like a human pinata. You both get to make like miscarriage jokes or whatever the offensive thing is.
The response again is inherent to trash talk. Even if you don't come back at me, that non-response is a kind of response, right?
Mm-hmm. Tim Duncan,
absolutely. Tim Duncan, John Stockton, right? These guys that used, that either ignored it or dismissed it, and focused instead on their own performance. That focusing on their performance is a kind of response. They're choosing not to engage with it is a kind of response. But how we respond, the nature of our response helps define the character of the trash talk itself, right? Like, if you say something that's insulting, quote unquote, but I don't allow myself to be insulted by it, was it insulting, right? If you say something that's meant to be upsetting, but I don't allow myself to be upset by it, then it wasn't upsetting, sort of definitionally, right? But at the same time, if you say something that, in my mind, crosses a kind of moral line, right? If you say something that's racist, if you say something that's homophobic, and I choose to ignore that, that's a little bit more of a gray area, right? Like it's, by not responding, am I helping to normalize that kind of discourse? And so do I have a moral imperative to then respond to you, even if it comes at the cost of my own competitive performance? And I don't have an answer to that, but to me, that's one of the more fascinating tensions that exists in this space.
Yeah, you seem to like these stories. Like, they're sports stories, but they're also non-sports stories. Your first book, Arena, kind of like it documented a lot of the culture around like game day, for example, and like cookouts and things like that. Like the way we kind of approach and who's working at the arenas and things like that. And this one, Trash Talk, is again, it's another game within the game, I guess is the best way to put it, right? What is it you're looking for? Why are you telling these kind of like quote unquote alternative stories? You know what I mean? Outside of the traditional, like that Super Bowl was amazing and like Patrick Mahomes is a great football player.
I don't know. Those have always been the stories I've been drawn to. And I don't know if it's just because like in terms of my own writing career, I've been, or at least it's felt like I've been something of an outsider in some ways. Like I've never been a beat reporter. even when I've, most of my jobs, working editorially have been kind of like feeling like I need to prove myself, need to find the interesting angle. But those are also the writers that I'm drawn to, the people who, write the story you didn't expect, write about the topic you're unfamiliar with, or write about the familiar topic in an unfamiliar way, right? Give you a new way to look at something that you thought you knew. For my first book, The Arena, I really wanted to explore, it's these spaces that we're familiar with but almost go unseen, so it was like the subcultures and shadow worlds that exist in and around the game. And for trash talk, it felt very similar to me because it's this thing, it's in the ether, right? Especially for those of us who grew up in the 90s. Like, trash talk is everywhere. It's like this intangible thing that informs the way we speak, the way we compete, the way we interact with one another. But nobody's ever actually explored what it means to be a trash talker, or where it comes from, or how it works. And so I wanted to understand that, not just in terms of, athletics and sports, and so we can better understand these people we hold up and idolize or disparage because they don't handle it well, or we find them to be unsportsmanlike. But also because I think by looking at it, we will understand ourselves better as people, because competition is a pretty universal, human pursuit. Like, whether it's socially, whether it's athletically, whether it's politically, we compete with one another. And I think this helps us understand something about ourselves as social and competitive creatures. So I thought there was a lot of, open ground here. Is the short answer to that long response.
Yeah, no, I get it, because like, until I'd seen like an advanced blurb of your book or whatever, I was like, oh yeah, we never really do talk about trash talking. Like, there's so many podcasts and so many articles and so many different books and documentaries about sports, about athletes, all kinds of different tracks or whatever, right? But trash talking, which is one of those things, like, even we have shoe documentaries, you know what I mean? We talk a lot about the shoes that the players wear. But trash talking as one of the things that we just kind of do, this is like, nobody's really ever acknowledged it. And I'm like, I was grateful that you took the time to do it, because I'm like I said, I grew up in the 80s and 90s basketball. So I'm like, I love this stuff. Like, more like, you know what I mean? Like, I love the Reggie Miller versus Spike Lee and Gary Payton and like.
Well, and that goes back. I mean, this stuff is inherently, it's inherently attractive. It draws us in. It's magnetic, right?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, one of the core functionalities of talking trash is it raises the stakes of competition. It raises the psychological stakes, right? It puts more on the line. It makes the outcome of the match matter more than it otherwise would. So when you see two people talking trash, it brings meaning to this encounter that it wouldn't necessarily otherwise have. There's something almost existential about that. So of course we're drawn to it. But then when we're drawn to it, and this is the same stuff as like, rap beefs on Twitter, or reality television, straight to camera, shit talking, the drama, it's drama. This is at its core, it's drama. So we love it. But I feel like we should understand what's really happening when people are talking trash, to try to dissect it a little bit. What's really being said? What's really happening under the surface? Because I think when we don't understand what's happening, we run the risk of responding in an inappropriate way. And that could be, that response could be competitively, like we get upset at someone, or we feel threatened by what someone's saying, or it could be an inappropriate response societally. Again, that's like we start to penalize what people are saying, because we don't understand what they're really suggesting in their trash talk, because we don't recognize it, or we don't penalize, we don't restrict it, because we do simply accept it, even when what is being suggested, what's being introduced into the public sphere, is something really toxic. And that's I would make the case, right, with some online discourse and political discourse with Trump in particular, that is what's happening. And we should understand that when it's happening, so that, again, we can respond in the right way, in the way we want to respond.
It mirrors a lot of the articles you see like in Forbes magazine and stuff like that. Like, can you curse at work? Right? And sometimes you'll see like people that drop F-bombs are intelligent people, or like we see those kind of like back and forth, right? Like, don't use this type of language at work, or like I said, like people who swear are more intelligent, and like, so it's kind of like getting at what you're saying, which is like just understanding the things that we kind of take for granted, the social norms and the way that we operate and the ball busting and the things that we do, which is what trash talking is, and just kind of unpacking it. So thank you for that. Yeah, so the book is called Trash Talk, the only book about destroying your rivals. So thank you for helping me do that.
Yeah. The only book about destroying your rivals that isn't total garbage. Because of course we had to talk a little trash in the book title too.
And just one quick last question: when you talked to Jeff Ross, did he do anything? Did he say anything to you? Did you get trashed by Jeff Ross? Because that would be an honor too, right?
Yeah, it certainly would have been. No, Jeff didn't make fun of me. I think.
Oh darn! Next time.
Yeah, maybe next time. It's kind of like if you walk up to a sports reporter, I think at a bar who's just having a beer when he's off duty, he might not want to talk. He might not want to talk to you about the Knicks second rotation. But so maybe we were talking in a professional, in the professional context, so he wasn't on the clock.
Yeah. When Don Rickles died, a lot of comics or people that work in comedy were telling stories about the things that he said to them, and it was like a badge of honor, right? You want
for sure, absolutely. Well, that's again, in the right context, talking trash is inherently flattering, right? It's because someone views you as someone who's worth talking trash to,
or at least, and they know who you are too, right? So
they recognize you as a threat. They recognize you as a rival. And that's if you understand it in the right way, it's an inherently flattering thing.
Yeah. All right, that's a positive note. We can end it there. Thank you so much for hanging out. Thank you so much for the book. As you can tell, I clearly enjoyed it. So, do you have any ideas or anything for what you're thinking about for your next book? Like I said, I know this one just came out, but have you started thinking a little bit more?
There's so much in this book that I feel like this, I feel like everyone who writes a book says I could have written 6 books, based on all the information that I came across here. But I'm not saying this will be another book, but I do think that there's a lot of interesting space and kind of, mental toughness and, performance under pressure, that some of the stuff that I had to learn about, because again, when you talk trash to someone, you're putting pressure on their performance, you're raising the stakes on their performance. And the response to that, responding in a mentally tough way is so important in those moments. So I'd be curious to see if there's something in that space that I might be able to find an angle for, but no guarantees at this point.
Yo, that was Rafi Kohan talking about his outstanding book, Trash Talk, the only book about destroying your rivals that isn't total garbage. I'm Sammy, host of My Summer Lair. In the introduction to this episode, I talked about how much I adore trash talking. Oh, and I do. We didn't fully cover it in this conversation, but trash talking is about accountability. It is recognizing your gifts, your abilities, the time and the work you've put in to get to this point, and establishing your presence. It is a common human experience. It's so dumb, but it is a common human experience to be overlooked, to be undervalued. People will consistently doubt you. That's why trash talking is beautiful, because it's a rejection of the doubts and asserting I'm good. This isn't arrogance. It's understanding who you are and effectively communicating that fact. Michael Jordan is good at basketball. Steph Curry is good at shooting. Stephen King is good at writing. These are not controversial opinions. These are facts. You can hate, you can be jealous, you can resent, you can dispute, and it's all as useless as getting angry at the sky for raining on your picnic. Accepting that you're good naturally creates accountability. You gotta serve the gifts you've been given. If you're good at writing, that doesn't mean you have a responsibility to craft a bestseller, but it does mean you gotta write. That's why trash talking is inspiring, because it reminds people you are good. Because as much as people will doubt you, they will also resent you as well. I thought you said you could write. You told me you know how to play ball, you just missed 5 shots in a row. You said you were good. This is resentment, but in a warped sort of way, it's also accountability. When you're good, you want people to hold you accountable. We do this all the time. Kevin Durant is an amazing basketball player. And yet, for all his gifts, for his status, he should have more championships. There's accountability there. In the 1988 All-Star 3-point contest, we're talking Danny Ainge, Dale Ellis, I think Byron Scott was on there. Cleveland Cavaliers point guard Mark Price. We're talking some incredible 3-point shooters. Larry Bird walked into this change room, looked around at Craig Hodges, Seattle's Dale Ellis, Cleveland Cavaliers point guard Mark Price. Looked around at all these guys and announced to this change room of incredible snipers and shooters, guys, have you decided who's coming in second? Bam! That's fantastic. Larry Bird understood he was good and he effectively communicated it to that room. That's hope. That incites your passions and motivates your vision. That's refreshing. It's also a tight snap. This conversation is far from over. We gotta talk some more. And yeah, some of that talk will be trash. Sign up for My Pal Sammy newsletter at mysummerlair.com/subscribe or Google My Pal Sammy Substack. Think your fingers can handle all that? I don't know why you're still listening to me right now instead of Googling My Pal Sammy Substack and signing up. Man, I heart trash talking so much. Good days. Thank you so much for listening to me in a Netflix world. Trash talk, yo.